Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. If I may have your attention, please, for the afternoon session. Welcome back to all of you. I am the ambassador of Belgium here in Qatar, representing the Minister of Development Cooperation of Belgium in his function as ECOSOC Vice President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thanks to Qatar for organizing this conference. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the panel on overcoming challenges to mobilizing sovereign wealth funds for sustainable development goal investments. The topic of our discussion deals with the crux of the financing challenge we face in implementing the transformative 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. How do we move from billions to trillions to meet the large financing needs of the SDGs? Investment needs for infrastructure alone are estimated to be in the range of several trillion USD a year. No one source alone can meet these enormous requirements. In the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, world leaders recognized the enormity of the challenge by stressing the need to mobilize all sources of finance, public and private, national and international, in a complementary and synergetic way. They singled out institutional investors as a large but underutilized source of sustainable development finance, and encouraged sovereign wealth funds to allocate a greater percentage to infrastructure, particularly in developing countries. While estimates vary and data are scarce, it is believed that sovereign wealth funds hold about $6.5 trillion in assets. Given the huge resources managed by these funds, a small increase of their investment in SDGs in developing countries could make a big impact on their development. However, while these institutions have long been targeting economic infrastructure projects, only in recent years have they also become increasingly aware of the opportunities available for investment in developing countries, as well as in new sectors relevant to the implementation of the SDGs, such as education, healthcare, and green investments. It is indeed encouraging to see that sovereign wealth funds are beginning to realize that investing into the SDGs makes economic, social, and environmental sense. Such investments can help governments plan and ensure that when natural resources are exhausted, people and governments have other resources and options to draw on. Moreover, putting money into renewable energy and green infrastructure not only provides financial risk diversification for countries that generate most revenues from extractive industries, it also helps offset their negative environmental footprint. Our objective today must therefore be to come up with a game plan that helps scale up these types of investment and better align the investment strategies of sovereign wealth funds with the SDGs. For this purpose, we need to better understand the barriers that are holding back sovereign wealth funds investments in key sustainable development sectors, notably in developing countries. Constraints range from entry barriers to foreign investors, to perceptions of inadequate risk-return ratios of investment in the SDGs. They may also include a lack of information and effective packaging and promotion of projects, as well as a lack of investor experience in unfamiliar markets in developing countries. Other barriers are more specific to sovereign investors. For example, many of them lack the expertise and internal capacity to undertake direct investment in new asset classes that are relevant to the SDGs. A deeper understanding of such obstacles will therefore help us to understand how to create the right incentives and enabling environments so that progressively more sovereign wealth funds orient their investments in the direction of the world's sustainable development needs. Ladies and gentlemen, let us be pragmatic, practical, and action-oriented in our deliberations today. Our ultimate objective should be to arrive at concrete and actionable recommendations to the upcoming FFD forum on how to turn sovereign wealth funds into one of the key actors in funding the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just been informed that our main speaker is unable to make it, unfortunately, but it is my pleasure to give the floor to our moderator for this afternoon, Dr. Rajiv Sharma, who is a fellow at the research director at the Global Projects Center at Stanford University. Rajiv, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you to the Chair, His Excellency Mr. Bart de Groof, for the opening remarks. I would also like to extend my thanks to the State of Qatar and UNDISA for organizing this very worthwhile conference. It is my pleasure to be here to talk about the role of sovereign wealth funds for supporting the Sustainable Development Agenda. I plan to highlight some of the key points from the background paper provided as a reference for this conference, and then we will move into a panel to discuss the issues. So firstly, sovereign wealth funds have been growing in size and importance over the last few decades. This has been primarily on the back of a commodity boom in many places around the world. In the year 2000, there were only about 19 or 20 sovereign wealth funds in the world. Now there are over 80, representing over $6.5 trillion, with more being created all the time. In understanding the potential of sovereign wealth funds for contributing to sustainable development, one must understand the different types of funds being created and the different associated objectives which impacts how they go about their investments. Firstly, you have stabilization funds, which are created to assist with balancing short-term fiscal positions for a government. They are designed to insulate the budget and economy against volatility, generally commodity price fluctuations, and act as an additional policy tool for meeting government payments and foreign exchange commitments. Savings or reserve funds are set up mainly from commodity windfalls with the objective of investing excess reserves for the benefit of future generations. Pension reserve funds are saving surpluses that will be used for a specific purpose in the future. The funds come from commodity windfalls or out of the current tax base of a country. Finally, development funds are set up with the primary objective to fund socio-economic projects or to invest in specific sectors within a country. Generally speaking, stabilization funds are likely to have the lowest risk appetite and shorter-term horizon, in line with their shorter-term liabilities. Development funds, on the other hand, have a longer time horizon and have the flexibility to invest in illiquid, alternative private market asset classes. So in the paper for this conference, it is argued that the Sustainable Development Agenda is an issue of long-term investment. We need well-directed, focused, long-term investment in order to address the most pressing challenges of our time. Crucially, sovereign wealth funds can theoretically provide a large source of this long-term investment capital. There are, however, a number of structural barriers to mobilizing this capital, as described, such as the liability structure and risk appetite of the funds, and crucially, their governance and resource capability. Based on the types of sovereign wealth funds, there are certain models of investment that have been adopted in order to meet the respective fund objectives. Firstly, there is the Norway model, adopted by the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is essentially based on investing in traditional public market asset classes in stocks and bonds. The Norway model is largely an in-sourced model without the reliance of external private managers. Just need to check that the slides are consistent with what I'm saying. So the endowment model is the second model, initiated by David Swenson, the Chief Investment Officer at the Yale Endowment in the United States. Is based on adding risk to a portfolio by investing in longer-term alternative asset classes, such as infrastructure, real estate, private equity, but by doing it using external private sector managers, which can be quite a costly method. The Canadian model, based on the practices of the large Canadian pension funds, is associated with investing in alternative private market asset classes using in-house resources to do so. This requires a fund to hire the expert internal staff to execute the investment program on a more cost-effective basis than using those external managers. We've started to see a fourth model emerge, termed the collaborative model, which is associated with long-term investors developing innovative partnerships amongst themselves, such as co-investment platforms and joint ventures, to invest in private assets without the need of external managers. So sovereign wealth funds have generally adopted one of these models or a combination of these models for executing their investment objectives and strategy. Regardless of the model adopted, we can see that there are ways that sovereign wealth funds can support the sustainable development agenda right across the asset class spectrum. Within the public market space, there are fixed income products such as social impact bonds or green bonds that investors can invest into. For equities markets, there are mutual funds and exchange-traded funds that are screened specifically for environmental, social, and governance aspects. There are methods being developed to track a portfolio for SDG exposure, but these are at an early stage of development. As these metrics are developed further with the aid of technology, targeted investments in the public markets for the SDGs is likely to grow. But without doubt, however, as illustrated in the background paper, the most impact that sovereign wealth fund investors can have for the sustainable development agenda will come from investments made in the private market space. Unlisted private equity funds, those under the endowment model, are starting to measure the wider impact of their investments in line with the SDGs. There are also specific impact investment funds. The majority of them argue for a profit-oriented model to achieve the most impact in various sectors. But it's through the direct collaborative model where investments are made in private markets that sovereign wealth funds can have the most impact. Although this is usually only restricted to the larger, more sophisticated funds that have the in-house capability to make the complex investments on their own. In the paper, there are a number of case studies highlighted. I won't go into the details here, but provide a few insights. Firstly, there are certain sovereign development funds that have had specific development objectives and yet have been able to achieve very good financial returns. These include Singapore's Temasek, Malaysia's Khazanah, and South Africa's Public Investment Corporation. There are certain elements within these organizations where there are lessons that can be learned for other funds. The National Investment and Infrastructure Fund in India is an example of a sovereign fund set up by the government of India to invest in the country's infrastructure sector. The fund has been set up to catalyze investment from other sovereign funds into India's infrastructure and utilizes the collaborative model to do so. A few weeks ago, the fund achieved its first close, securing investment from the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and some other domestic investors. The Aligned Intermediary is an example of a new initiative in the United States to help support long-term investors, like sovereign funds, invest into climate infrastructure around the world. The initiative was born out of the problem with traditional fund structures of venture capital and private equity firms that did not allow for a long enough time horizon to allow capital-intense companies in the clean technology space reach market because of their long gestation periods. Finally, I highlight two initiatives in Australia and Canada. where the respective governments have innovatively partnered directly with long-term investors to facilitate investments into infrastructure. As mentioned, there are lessons that can be applied in other regions. The key conclusions and recommendations from the paper include more work being required to develop specific SDG metrics that sovereign wealth funds are able to appraise their investments on across their entire portfolio. This will help sovereign wealth fund investors track their investments and positively make goal-based investments. Governments should be incorporating aspects of sustainable development or responsible investment into the inaugurating legislation of sovereign wealth funds. For emerging economies looking to attract sovereign wealth fund capital, governments have a role to play to help package opportunities in a way that makes them investable to sovereign wealth fund investors. Finally, a sovereign development fund could be created to provide foreign sovereign wealth funds a trusted local partner to co-invest in the priority sectors of the government, yet still attractive for commercial investors. So I will stop there and pass the floor on to Mr. Adam Robbins, who will share some of his own remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. I'd like to thank the government of Qatar and UNDESA for the opportunity to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. My first time in Qatar, I was here almost exactly 3 years ago to speak with the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds, where QIA hosted that meeting. So, and I believe Dr. Sharma was at that meeting as well, and so is Mr. Rensendorsch. So it's a pleasure to be here again. And that photo up there is just from that visit. So it's just as beautiful today in Doha as it was then. To start, I'd like to give a broad context from a long-term investor's point of view of the SDGs and broadly how they fit into an investment mandate. My work at World Economic Forum focuses broadly on long-term asset owners, so sovereign funds being a key part of that, as well as pensions, endowments, and foundations. So to give some context for this group of what motivates that group of investors, I'd like to point out that almost all of these long-term investors and long-term asset owners have legal investment mandates. As Dr. Sharma referred to, some of them are focused on stabilizing commodity revenues, others are for long-term savings, but they're almost all codified in law, usually with a risk-return target. And so that creates a very specific focus and a legal mandate for what their managers should and should not invest in. That being said, the SDGs and a lot of the themes that fall within those buckets are quite well aligned with the investment objectives of long-term investors. But I just want to make this point because I believe it's value in terms of investment value and investment returns rather than values or political priorities that will move large amounts of capital. So that's the sort of the key perspective I'd like to highlight and like to initiate this presentation with. Quite fortunately, sustainability and broadly the growth of frontier markets, the growth of emerging markets, the rise of the EM consumer, and the global need for infrastructure, those are all global megatrends that do fit within a long-term investment mandate. So for alignment between the SDGs and long-term investors, there's quite a lot of economic ground to work from. And particularly, sovereign funds, as have been highlighted on this panel, are especially well suited to this task, not just because of their long-term horizon, but also because of their scale. Sovereign funds typically start from a few $1 billion and range into the hundreds of billions of dollars. And then also their risk tolerance. Many are structured, have a governance structure that insulates them from market trends. And so they can really place long-term bets on trends that they believe in. Having laid out that financial basis, I will highlight that responsibility and leadership within the investor community are important factors and important motivators for sovereign funds. Some funds will express these views in a responsible investment policy. Others will simply act on them implicitly But I do want to point out that economic co-benefits of investment is something that's often at the front of mind for sovereign fund leaders. And so this can be the economic benefits coming from infrastructure investment, or from investing in healthcare, or in green tech. But there are ongoing efforts to try to quantify those and to try to bring those in to the investment mandate. So that's one aspect of a responsible investment policy that this group should bear in mind. Second, I'd like to point out that sovereign funds are unique in the way they work and in the community that they've built. Because they're government owned, often they'll have policy connections and global connections that can enable them to create networks and to create scale that makes investing in new markets feasible in ways that it wouldn't be for other types of investors. And then also on that, I'll point out that returns are where the investors aren't yet. So as investors seek returns, as they seek new markets, a lot of the SDGs will align with those areas. You know, we've spoken today and yesterday about the large gap that needs to be filled by investors. And so from an asset owner's perspective, that can represent an investment opportunity, an area where investors aren't yet, where there can be a source of returns that hasn't been captured by the market yet. We were asked to give clear recommendations to different types of stakeholders on how we can channel investment funds towards the SDGs. So I'd like to break this down into a couple different groups, for financial investors, for the policy community, and then for investment recipient countries. For financial investors, I think it's important to understand that the sovereign fund community, what it looks like, and what are the qualities of a good investment partner. Over the past decade or so, we've seen an increasing professionalization in the sovereign fund community as the institutions have matured. Many of them were only founded within the past few decades, so QIA 2005, for example. And so over those years, the institutions have matured and grown in capability, and so they've become much more attractive investment partners than they were in the past. I'd also like to point out that for financial investors, one thing they can do is they can share knowledge within their community. So looking at the sovereign funds and, for example, the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds, which Mr. Rentzendoors represents, it's an important tool for sharing knowledge across the investor community, from the large and sophisticated institutions like QIA or like some of the large Asian funds to the newer sovereign funds. And this isn't always an altruistic exercise. While some funds do approach it with a development angle or a capacity building angle, in the long term, it can be quite worthwhile to have a skilled investment partner in a frontier market or in an emerging market. And so engaging with those institutions early on questions of good governance, on questions of political independence, and on questions of investment strategy can start to pay off over the long term as they become a viable investment partner. And these successful partnerships, these are long and deep partnerships. So often sovereign funds or pension funds will pick a specific country or a specific geography to focus on, and they'll get to know that country. They'll get to know the professional services community. They'll get to understand the rule of law and how that works. They'll understand the tax regime and the local institutional investors. So by making that investment of time, they can create a strong and lasting investment bond. And that can be quite beneficial to bring in capital to new countries or new sectors that have been previously overlooked. For the policy community, I do want to point out that as much as we've spoken about investment and supporting the SDGs, some markets are simply not investable. And that can be because of political instability, because of a lack of rule of law. Sometimes just the risk-return profile of fulfilling an SDG will not align with the legal mandates of the institutional investor community. And that's important to bear in mind, and that's where official development assistance comes in. Another point for the policy community, I think it's important to match investment solutions with the governance and with the sort of capacity structure of the country or of the sector in which they're investing. So if it's into a frontier market, the solution will be quite different and perhaps sort of less involved than if it's into an emerging market or a more established market or a more established sector. And then for investment recipient countries, I think there are also some clear lessons from the history and from the development of the sovereign fund community. I think one is that sovereign fund outcomes can vary significantly. And so because of that, it's really important to find and to identify and replicate best practice. I think most sovereign funds, if you look back at the past few decades, have been successful in fulfilling their objectives. But there's some that aren't. There's some that haven't been because of rule of law issues or political stability issues. So it's important to understand what has driven some success in some countries and what has prevented it in others. The positive part is that the sector has professionalized over the past decade. And so that makes a big difference. And then finally, also, I'd say for investment recipient countries that are considering building a sovereign fund or building a vehicle to attract capital, build that institution gradually, scale it up gradually. It's difficult enough to operate an institutional investor in any context, and that's particularly true when you're trying to solve sort of unaddressed investment needs like the SDGs, or when you're trying to be active in frontier markets. To wrap this up, I just want to point out some strategic investment funds that have been successful and to highlight a few intricacies of their models that might be worth considering when creating funds or trying to channel funds towards addressing the SDGs. There's some multilateral institutions have created funds. So for example, European Investment Bank has created a green energy efficiency and renewable energy fund in 2008 that's capitalized at 112 billion euros. So that's an example of a multilateral fund. European Funds for Strategic Investment would also be an example of that. These multilateral funds are quite appealing in that they can allow you to bring in external skills and credibility quite quickly. The association with a multilateral institution can mitigate risk, which is also quite useful. I think one challenge is that it can be difficult to align actual investment objectives with the political objectives or the rationale for starting the fund. So that's just one point of caution there. Sovereign development funds are another useful vehicle, and that I highlight on the chart behind me the Irish Strategic Investment Fund and Senegal's FONSIS. Both of these have been successful in bringing in capital to sectors that they've targeted as crucial. So to consider FONSIS, for example, they've brought in money from a variety of investment partners, from private sector investors to multilateral institutions like IFC, and they've put it into sectors that they've identified as impactful for the country's development and which align quite well with the SDGs. So they've invested in agriculture, they've invested in solar power. So a strategic investment fund that's owned by a sovereign state can align extremely well with SDG fulfillment. A challenge on some benefits of this are that they offer local knowledge if it's owned by the local community, so that can help facilitate transactions. It can be easy to integrate into economic policy, but on the flip side, it's quite hard to execute because of the local political pressures, because of capacity constraints in bringing in staff to operate in the frontier market. So it's a powerful tool, but difficult to execute in practice. And then finally, one other model I'd like to highlight are public-private partnerships. So there are a few countries which have partnered with private sector investment managers to create investment vehicles that have economic policy focuses. And so for one, I'll highlight the Mexico Macquarie Infrastructure Fund and also a similar fund in the Philippines. These are managed fully by professional asset managers, but they've taken chunks of capital from the state, and they've worked with the state to craft the investment mandate. And one advantage of that is it allows for significant leverage, both from debt and then also by bringing in external third-party asset managers. So for the Mexico example, the state of Mexico has put in, I think about $50 million, but then they've brought in pension money from Europe, and they've brought in private sector money as well. And so that's allowed quite a rapid deployment of a large amount of cash. One advantage of this model is that it outsources to a professional what otherwise is a very complex task. And it also taps into existing investment networks. So instead of having to build all of those investment relationships, if you can outsource them, you can also draw upon the network that fund will have. And these can also be suitable for low capacity environments in the sense that you can bring in expertise quickly. But again, the challenge is, can you supervise it? So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and turn it back over to Dr. Sharma.
Thank you, Mr. Robbins. I will now pass the floor to Mr. Bayaskalan Ransadorj, who will now say a few words on the topic.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure here, and thank you for this opportunity to join this panel. First, I'd like to note again that sovereign wealth funds are really a heterogeneous group, so structured in many different ways, with many different mandates. So as long-term investors, sovereign wealth fund, essentially strategic investment funds, could emerge as one of the potential sources of funding to fill the gap of financing the sustainable development. But when it comes to implementation, it is important to have a well-planned sovereign asset liability structures in place before in terms of financing. So it should be based on advanced microfinancial assessments, and that really help understand country-specific transmission channels that related to what financial instruments that can be deployed for what purposes. So recent development is that many countries setting up strategic investment funds and extensively adopting second policy mandate or economic objectives in addition to existing financial objectives. And this policy mandate is measured by economic rate of return, ERR, which provides a good estimate of social and economic impact of an investment. And in terms of new investment model, like mentioned here before, partnership and co-investment model is really taking off big time. So we see more and more co-investments between sovereigns, sovereign wealth funds, and recent examples include Italian CDP Equity and Qatar Investment Authority partnership, and Omani State General Reserve Fund and Vietnam State Investment Corporation. They formed very successful partnership co-investment model, and then in terms of IRR, it's performing extremely good, and we saw they showed very successful strategic partnerships. And second interesting trend I wanted to mention is many governments utilizing sovereign wealth funds as an important component in diversifying the economy. So for example, we know many Gulf-based sovereign funds, they have mandates to invest non-hydrocarbon sectors and support more into renewable energy, technology, and some other strategic industries. Next trend we see very often is many countries setting up strategic investment funds as a cornerstone of national transformation and growth catalyst. So for example, Kazakhstan, Samruk-Kazyna, and Turkey Wealth Fund, for example, they are restructuring their state-owned enterprises and bringing more capital into local economy through their sovereign fund structure, which is very important for economic development. And as discussed, strategic investment funds can act as a cornerstone or seed investor in key development sectors and crowding in private capital in strategically important projects such as large-scale infrastructure projects. However, to make it investable, countries may need to reorganize and professionalize the market to make it accessible. So I think extensive adoption of innovation in social entrepreneurship we discussed this morning could be one solution to overcome this barrier. And important to note, another important thing to note that is success really rests on the individual fund's ability to balance policy and commercial objectives. That comes to the discussion of good governance and transparency issues. And one interesting solution we found was Adam briefly mentioned Philippine Infrastructure Fund. It's managed by Maguire Infrastructure Management Company and fully outsourced management. But in terms of performance and transparency and accountability, it's really delivering very effective results. So we see many different models testing and working out there. So going forward, this co-investment model we see will take more traction. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Renchadorg, for those remarks. So as the moderator, I have the pleasure of asking the panelists some questions on the topic before opening questions to the floor. So to start, Mr. Renchadorg, a big part of the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds is the promotion and conforming of members to the Santiago Principles. Can you talk a bit about these principles and the important role they play in promoting investment in sustainable development for sovereign wealth funds?
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Santiago Principles provide practical guidance on the sovereign wealth fund management that includes fund governance and operational compliance and investment and risk management framework that are necessary for sound long-term investment practice. So when it comes to implementation of the principles, process of implementation really depending on the individual country economic background, legal structure, so level of implementation is very different. But we understand it requires commitment, and it's a long-term process. So at the IFSWF, we encourage exchange of experience among our member sovereign funds in terms of best practice in governance and transparency and investment practice in line with international standards.
Just to follow up a question there, the Santiago Principles administer for and sort of encourage maximizing commercial return for these investors. So does the adherence to ESG principles or SDGs mean lower returns? And I'll get you to provide a response, and then Mr. Robbins, perhaps you can follow up to that question afterwards.
Sure. Current practice, you're exactly right. The current practice shows that sovereign wealth fund legislation sets the requirement sovereign wealth funds to pursue set risk-adjusted returns. And impact investing, SDG and ESG issues are not really in the map yet. So but we see more and more traction, more members adopting ESG and ESG mostly related and climate change as a new asset class, the related talks. So one thing we see is we need to promote and educate members on the new investment policies that they could adopt within their portfolio, which could be implemented through their investment decisions. So that's something we're working on right now.
Thank you, Mr. Renchadorg. Just to follow up, Mr. Robbins, do you believe that adherence to ESG principles and the SDGs means lower returns for these investors?
I think the trick to incorporating the SDGs into a financially motivated investment philosophy is to put the SDGs into an investment language that can then be acted upon. I think they seem quite abstract for many investors, but they can be broken down into a fairly concise way that allows for direct investment action. So let me walk through how that might work out. Some of the SDGs. We've spoken this morning about water and sanitation. We've spoken about clean energy or agriculture. I think those are easily mapped over to asset classes and particular regions in which investors could invest and that fall within their investment strategies that would have a clear impact. They're financially desirable, they match with global trends, with global growth, and they can address the SDGs in quantifiable ways. So I'd say that's one category, or SDGs that are directly investable. I'd make a second category of SDGs where investors could see that helping to implement the SDG could reduce investment risk. So I think climate is the most obvious connection here, where some investors are looking at the carbon exposure or other sort of carbon exposure both for the assets that their companies hold and both also emissions that their portfolio companies produce, and thinking about how can they reduce that. And that is something that has a long, that you want to reduce that. One, sure, because it helps with the SDGs. It also reduces a long-term financial risk, which is exposure to climate change. And so that's another area where you can map on an SDG perspective onto an existing portfolio. And in that sense, it would be additive to financial return rather than detract. And then I guess one final point, I think a lot of investors struggle to figure out how do we address SDGs like gender equality, or how do we address economic inequality. I think they see those as quite nebulous, but I think one way to approach it is to incorporate those values into their strategies as active owners of their portfolio. So an investor could view, for example, that improving gender equality is something that improves corporate performance. And there are studies supporting this, showing the value of diverse boards and diverse management. And they say, okay, then that maps over to our responsibility as an investor. So we should encourage our portfolio companies to diversify their leadership. Or similarly on economic inequality, they can pay attention to compensation at their portfolio companies. So they're not sectors that they can invest in directly, but there are actions that investors can take in working with their portfolios and working with corporates to support the SDG implementation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rinchadorj, what kind of benchmarks are available for ESG or SDG incorporation? And out of the members from the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds or otherwise, which are the funds that are leading the way in these practices?
Yeah, adoption of ESG strategy is really new to many sovereign wealth funds, and we follow and partner with, for example, UNPRI, principles for responsible investment, and how our member funds, for example, could adopt their principles within their portfolio. And then really leading funds who are successfully implementing this practice right now is New Zealand Super Fund, Australian Future Fund, and Canadian and other big funds as well. But it's really in a starting and testing phase.
Thank you for those remarks. I believe we have 15 minutes left for this session, so at this point I will open questions to the floor. If there are any questions, please raise your hand or your name badge. And that's it? Okay. So we have a question from Mr. Stefano Prato, Society for International Development. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Again, speaking on behalf of the civil society FFD group. So I have 3 quick questions. The first one is, I would ask the panelists if they could elaborate a little bit on the concept of fiduciary mandates and fiduciary responsibility of fund managers. The background of the question is that it may sometimes be the case that we have win-win situations in which return rates and other public objectives would go hand in hand. But it's also possible that this will not be the case, and actually pursuing multiple objectives may actually decrease the return rate, and how these therefore relate to fiduciary mandates and fiduciary responsibilities, and to some extent you see an evolution or any movement in assessing fiduciary mandates and responsibility in accordance to this. This is my first question. My second question has to do with the ESG principles, and I wonder if you could share information on what is the current level of take-up of ESG principles within sovereign wealth funds, at least to the extent that this is known. And then lastly, whenever we talk about transforming public goods, infrastructure and others into asset classes, what tension do we create, particularly between the public good concept and the asset class concept of that very same good, particularly when this refers to issues like a water, in which you actually have a human right to water. So there is, to some extent, a tension between the public goods approach and the asset class approach, and I would invite the panelists to elaborate on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Perhaps I can answer, or I'll provide my remarks and then you can follow up. So to address the first question, the concept of fiduciary mandates of fund managers, the way that I would answer that question is that amongst the sovereign wealth fund community, as has been mentioned on the panel, is that these funds have been set up in legislation by the respective governments, and usually, as indicated by the Santiago Principles, with the intent of maximizing commercial rate of return. And that is the objective and mission that is usually set up with which these sovereign wealth funds carry out their function. And so when it comes to the fiduciary obligation, those that are managing the capital within these funds have an obligation to adhere to that objective. And however, as you rightly pointed out, there are a number of development opportunities that can also lead to attractive commercial rates of return. And like we have mentioned, some of the biggest social environmental challenges represent deep investment opportunities that can deliver competitive financial returns. So it's notwithstanding the objective of these funds to maximize rate of return, there are opportunities, like you mentioned and appreciate, where the objectives go hand in hand. Where they don't go hand in hand, perhaps that is where the role of sovereign development funds have played a role in achieving some of these development objectives and some of the wider economic objectives. And by doing so, they are acknowledging their fiduciary obligations, I suppose. And so, depending on the type of fund, will determine how those fiduciary obligations are achieved. But generally speaking, maximizing rate of return is how that is addressed. To address the second question in terms of the take-up of ESG principles among sovereign wealth funds, like I mentioned in my presentation, there is a large spectrum amongst the sovereign wealth fund community in terms of sophistication and governance with which they carry out the function. And this is usually related to the size of assets under management. So the larger the fund, the better their ability to improve their governance and employ the required resources in-house to manage those resources effectively. And what we've noticed is that those larger, usually more sophisticated investors have been the ones that have incorporated those ESG factors in a greater way than the smaller funds that don't have the same ability to incorporate the same governance, the same in-house talent, and therefore processes when it comes to ESG. There are a couple of exceptions, as Mr. Renzo-Dorje mentioned, in the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, the Australian Future Fund, where perhaps in those geographies the importance of ESG, environmental social issues, are apparent. And because these funds are in the public eye, it forces them to adhere to those principles. Perhaps I'll pass on to Mr. Robbins and Mr. Renzo-Dorje to provide further comments on those first two questions.
Yeah, I'll weigh in on the ESG integration question, because I think it's something that the investment community has also not quite sorted out. How much have they integrated, and how to speak about this? I think that it's more a question of investment capacity at the institution and ability to think long term than an awareness of ESG itself. So to give an example, I think in the investment process for a sophisticated long-term investor, governance has always been a key consideration. And environmental risk has been a key consideration, and so has social. If you look at product safety, if you look at extractive industries, and both in equities and then also in debts, because corporate governance relates directly to the ability to repay a debt. So I think they've always been present for portfolio managers, but what has changed has been the realization that they need to focus on the longer term outcomes, and that their institutions are shifting and starting to be able to focus on the longer term outcomes as well. So if a portfolio manager or an institution has a very short term horizon, they're not going to fully integrate environmental concerns or governance concerns. But as the institution evolves to create more long-term incentives, and as the institution evolves to better establish and better fulfill its long-term mandate, at that point ESG will be more deeply integrated. And so I think the ESG language is helpful, the public pressure is helpful, but really the limiting factor now is on the capacity of the investment institution itself.
Just to add some practical perspectives, finding win-win situation in the concept of fiduciary duty. One good example is Moroccan Itmar Capital, Moroccan sovereign wealth fund. Its mandate is very broad, covers all economic sectors, and investment strategy aligns with country macroeconomic strategies. So they have double bottom line objectives, so support economic development, same time deliver financial performance. And so how they do is, in practice, they take strategic stakes, minority strategic stakes in socioeconomic projects, and promotes policies that contribute to the development of key sectors in the national economy. And so far, I know it's all about organizational capacity. So how well you can find win-wins, we'll see when their annual reports publish. On second point, ESG, we know a lot of sovereign wealth funds these days, they are reassessing, for example, climate change impact on their portfolio. And many sovereign funds, for example, Norwegian funds, they are decarbonizing their portfolio, so delisting many assets from their portfolio and expanding their asset allocation into different asset classes. So that's ongoing practice happening right now, so we'll see some results. Thank you.
And then to answer the third question, whether public goods should be made into asset classes, I think that question is a question of what the objectives of the government are when it comes to offering these assets to private investors. And in the work that we've done, we believe that that is a risk transfer exercise, in that those assets, because they could be complex infrastructure projects, should be shifted to the parties that are best able to manage those risks. Notwithstanding that, infrastructure has been offered as an asset class that provides predictable, stable cash flows to investors of this nature, sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. And that usually is amongst the brownfield operating assets within that asset class. And so to address the question, I think that it really requires an understanding of why the government is going through that process. And the government needs to utilize their tools of privatization as well as regulation to ensure that those goods are offered to the public in a way that maintains the wider use of them. And so there are tools to attract the financing, but it also requires managing that process through regulation, I believe. Are there any other questions from the floor? If there are no other questions, then I will hand the floor back to the chair.
Thank you, Rajiv. So yeah, if there are no more questions, there's only one thing for me left to do, that is to thank our panelists for the very informative interventions and for the interesting discussion afterwards. Thank you all, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.